In ancient Greece, gods and myths were incredibly important. They permeated just about every aspect of life, giving the Greeks a shared sense of identity and way of seeing the world. These gods and myths were different to what we understand today though. The Hellenes were polytheistic, poly meaning many, and theos meaning god. So polytheism is having many gods. So who were the Greek gods? And what were Greek myths? The major Greek gods were the Olympians, so called because they lived on the clouded peak of Mount Olympus. Zeus was the god of the skies and the king of the gods. Hera was his wife, the goddess of families and motherhood. Poseidon was the god of the seas, causing earthquakes and storms. And Hades kept the underworld with his three-headed dog Cerberus. The sun was ruled by Apollo and the moon was ruled by Artemis. Hephaestus controlled fire, Demeter the harvest, and Aphrodite gave beauty to the world. With so many gods to choose from, the gods that the Greeks chose to worship said much about them. The Athenians favoured Athena, the goddess of wisdom and knowledge, while the Spartans favoured Ares, the god of war. To most Greeks, the gods weren't just abstract concepts, they were very real, feasting, drinking, and meddling in human affairs. Greek gods and goddesses weren't perfect virtuous beings though. Unlike our idea of gods today, Greek gods were flawed. They made mistakes, they were selfish, lustful, they gambled, they sought revenge, and they were often deeply unfair to the humans who worshipped them. They weren't just good or bad, they were complicated, as were most characters in Greek stories or myths. There were demigods, who were half human, half god. There were titans, strange creatures, and mortal heroes. Some myths were simple and short, and some reached epic proportions. Heracles was essentially a superhero, using his superhuman strength to complete 12 tasks from the gods. Odysseus was a different type of hero, using his brains to outsmart a cyclops, or resist the temptation of sirens. Perseus used brains and brawn to kill Medusa, a monster whose gaze turned people to stone. And Jason, with help from goddesses and centaurs, gained a golden fleece, overcoming a dragon, giants, and some very smelly harpies. These myths were told around fires and in the public square, by parents to children and by priests to followers, and they were spoken out loud, being passed on by memory until the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, when they were written down and adapted into epic works of poetry by Homer and Hesiod. Mythos, a Greek word, is a collection of stories that help order the way that a culture sees or understands their world. So how did myths help the Greeks understand their world? Some myths helped the Greeks understand nature and the natural world, like the myth of Persephone, who was kidnapped by Hades and taken to the underworld to be his wife. Persephone's mother, Demeter, was distraught and refused to make the crops grow and the flowers bloom. After negotiations, Persephone was allowed out for 6 months of every year. So in the time Persephone was released, Demeter made the crops grow, and in the other 6 months when Persephone returned to the underworld, the crops withered and died, explaining to the Greeks the cycle of summer, autumn, winter, and spring. Other myths helped the Greeks understand moral ideas, right or wrong, like King Midas, who, in his greed, asked the gods that everything he touched might turn to gold. He soon found out that he couldn't eat, he couldn't touch the people he loved, and in the end, asked for this power to be returned, realizing that gold wasn't the most important thing in life. Some myths helped the Greeks understand where they came from and gave them a shared sense of history. The Iliad is a story of an epic war, probably based on a real-life war between the Greeks and Trojans during the Mycenaean period, hundreds of years before the archaic Greeks. It includes tragic heroes like Achilles and Hector, and stories of trickery like that of the Trojan horse. Many other myths describe the founding of cities or cultural practices, all of which gave the Greeks an understanding of their world and their place within history. So these myths help the Greeks understand the natural world, morality, and history. But how do these myths help us understand the Greeks? The first thing we know from these myths is that the Greeks were like us. They may not have had TV or the internet, but They craved stories and they craved entertainment. The difference is that their stories were told in person. Myths help us understand how sophisticated the Greeks were. These stories are not simple, and the gods and heroes are complicated. They're capable of both good and bad, like real human beings. In fact, this complicated nature of Greek mythology became central to a famous question posed by the philosopher Socrates, known as the Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it's good? Socrates knew that the gods were capable of all sorts of things: jealousy, cruelty, even murder, and this led him to ask, are things okay just because the gods do them? Or is there some other standard that makes things right or wrong? If so, what is that standard? The mere fact that Greek mythology was complicated enough to prompt questions like these shows us how sophisticated Greek society and morality was. Lastly, myths help us understand the Greek outlook on life. The Greeks had a concept called hubris, which is when a mortal becomes too proud and too confident, thinking themselves to be the same level as the gods, becoming cruel, arrogant, and dismissive of those around them. The gods took pleasure in punishing people that were hubristic, particularly Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. Icarus, who helped create a set of wings out of wax and feathers, thought he could fly as high as the gods. He was warned that he shouldn't, but he did anyway. He flew too close to the sun, where the wax melted. He lost his feathers and plunged to his death. Narcissus was an incredibly attractive man who was obsessed by the way he looked, to the point that he ignored and dismissed everyone else. The gods tricked him into looking into a perfectly reflective pool, where he became so attached to his own image that he became trapped, withering away and dying. Achilles, Heracles, Odysseus, Jason, they were all great heroes. They all suffered from hubris, and they all eventually fell, most punished by the gods in horrible ways. The Greeks knew that they were like these heroes. Greek society was smart, was strong, and could affect the world in profound ways. But these stories of hubris served to remind the Greeks that no matter how rich or powerful, beautiful or clever they became, the world didn't revolve around them. There were forces in the world that they couldn't control. They would grow old and they'd die. They'd get sick and they'd fall in love, and they'd face conflict, both from within and without. These forces wouldn't change any more than the gods would, so what mattered was how they faced the challenges, how they organised themselves, and the values that they chose to uphold. What Greek myths had to say about these challenges have inspired people throughout history, and the ideas have been reworked many times. First by the Romans, who had the same gods just with different names, and Renaissance art is filled with examples. It hasn't stopped either. Greek mythology still inspires ideas in books, TV series, movies, and academic fields like psychology, philosophy, and even astrophysics. What is polytheism? Name 5 Greek gods or heroes. How were Greek gods different to how we think of gods today? How did myths help the Greeks understand their world? What do myths tell us about the Greeks? What is hubris?